Let's talk about buying merchandise. And we're going to specifically start by talking about buying national brand merchandise. National brand merchandise is bought at either a wholesale market or at a trade show. And so we're going to start by talking about wholesale markets. Wholesale markets for retail buyers are a concentration of vendors within a specific geographic location. So a wholesale market is going to be a physical building that has permanent vendor showrooms that retailers can visit throughout the year. So imagine a shopping mall. But instead of a shopping mall where consumers go in and purchase products from retailers, this wholesale market is where retailers go in and they can shop from the vendors. And so you can go in to these vendor showrooms and look at all of the merchandise that they have for sale, and you can make purchases or place orders for the product that you wish to carry in your retail store. Now, these are permanent locations. Wholesale markets are permanent locations, so they're always available. So as a retailer, you can go anytime to a wholesale market. However, retail or wholesale markets often host market weeks during which buyers can make appointments to visit various vendor showrooms. And so during market weeks, the market is going to lease some temporary space to vendors who don't always have a permanent space in the store, and they're generally themed. So there'll be a women's fashion market week, a organic foods market week. There will be a shoes market week. There will be a window market week, right? If you are in the market of selling homes, then you have to maybe purchase some windows. So those market weeks are specific so that as a retailer, you can visit the most vendors for your category at a given time. So the Garment District in New York is the biggest wholesale market in the U.S. There are other large wholesale markets in London, Paris, Tokyo, Milan. Some of you may have been to the Atlanta Merchandise Mart or the America's Mart in Atlanta, which is one of the biggest wholesale market spaces in the U.S. And there's a video that I've posted in the Chapter 13 content folder for you to watch that gives you an idea of what happens when you as a vendor or you as a retailer go into America's Mart to shop for the vendors. So after you finish this lecture video, please do go in and watch the America's Mart video so that you can see kind of how a wholesale market works for retailers. Wholesale markets, like I said, are permanent spaces where retailers can go visit anytime they want to during the year. And most of the items that are bought at wholesale markets are fashion merchandise. So sometimes there are types of staple merchandise at a wholesale market, but it is generally where retailers go to buy their fashion merchandise. When retailers are looking for new staple merchandise categories, they tend to go to a trade show. And trade shows allow retail buyers to see the latest products and interact with their vendors. So if you are wanting to taste all of the new soups that Progresso has, you might do that at a canned foods trade show or a dinner soups trade show. So soup is a staple merchandise product, but they do introduce new flavors and different variations that you as a retailer might want to interact with before you decide whether or not to bring that product into your store. So trade shows are temporary spaces, and they generally set up in large convention centers, and they're there for just a week, sometimes just a few days. And so it's all temporary space where vendors buy booths and then they display their merchandise, and they generally have sales representatives available to talk to consumers as they come by. Some companies will bring in company executives just to kind of draw retail buyers into the space. So you're trying to draw attention to your new products. So if you're Hanes and you're introducing new undershirts, right? That's not exactly an exciting product, men's undershirts, but Hanes does introduce new styles and new variations. And so this is where retailers can go to look at those and try to determine whether or not they want to sell them in their retail stores. Other times, companies will bring in celebrities to try to draw attention to their booth. So we, at the paint company I worked for, we set up in many trade show booths during the year. And so we went to home and garden shows. We went to new builder trade shows. We went to new home construction, all of those types of trade shows. And generally, we would work with a celebrity who maybe was a famous home builder. We've worked with interior designers. And so we would have them at our booth at the trade show. And so we would make big announcements. We'd post it on social media. And that would draw people, that celebrity would draw people to our booth. And so then they can meet with the celebrity and we can try to sell our product. So at a trade show, you do have to try to find ways to separate yourself from your competitors because, again, staple merchandise is so common that you have to do big things to get retailers to purchase those products there. So there are large convention centers all across the United States where these people and retail vendors can set up. But the biggest ones in the U.S. happen to be in Las Vegas and Orlando, just as a heads up here. So let's talk about the buying process at a trade show or a wholesale market. The buying process, what happens is with fashion merchandise, buyers will generally make preset appointments with their key vendors. So the vendors that you normally buy from, you can set up appointments so you can show up and have that one-on-one time, or you can just show up to a booth and or a spot and start talking. And generally at the trade show or at the wholesale market, you are going to the market 5 to 6 times a year. And so you're going and you're looking at merchandise that's going to be for the next season. So you might go to the wholesale market in August and you're looking at clothes that will be selling in your store in January or February. So you're looking for the next season because you're doing this many months before delivery, because after you place your order, your vendors have to go manufacture that product. So you have to be very forward thinking at the market. With staple merchandise, you are going and you're setting up automatic replenishment orders. So it is that continuous replenishment process, and you can just go in and say, yes, I'd like to get this new soup brought into my store. Here's the authorization. Go ahead and ship me 100 cans every 2 weeks, right? So it starts to get into that system that way. So what happens is you're going to meet with your vendor. Generally, you discuss the performance of the merchandise, you review any upcoming merchandise, and you place your orders. And these are the things that happen at the wholesale market or the trade show. So when you're placing an order, you can do it at the trade show, but a lot of times retailers will return to their home office. So while they go to the wholesale market or they go to the trade show, they meet with the vendors, they talk about everything, they don't always place an order there. And the reason being is that prices are not normally negotiated at the market or at a trade show. So if you are making a purchase at the market or at the trade show, generally you're paying the price that the vendor wants. And so if you want to set aside time to negotiate, to try to ask for lower pricing, that's going to happen on the phone or over email later. So it's not going to happen at the market or at the show. So if you're not comfortable with the price of the merchandise at the trade show or at the wholesale market, as a retailer, you do have the option to return home, set up a future phone appointment to talk with your vendor to negotiate that pricing a little further. So that's how the process works for national brand merchandise. Let's switch gears and start talking about how we're going to develop and source our store brand merchandise. Generally, large retailers have in-house operations. So your Krogers, your Walmarts of the world, they have employees who specialize in identifying trends. They have employees who specialize in designing and making product specs. And so they're doing it all in-house. Some of these large retailers have their own manufacturing plants. Others work with manufacturers to make the products, but it's mostly done in-house. The other thing that helps with these large retailers is that they can monitor and manage their own conditions and of the manufacturing facility, and they also have a larger role in the quality control. If you're a large retailer and you're doing things in-house, it's definitely easier to manage quality. Now, if you're not a large retailer, but you'd like to have store brand products, a lot of times what happens is that you're going to work with a third-party company who specializes in developing private label brands. Mast Global Fashions is a third-party company who sources, manufactures, and delivers store brand merchandise to specific retailers. There is a company called L Brands, and they own Victoria's Secret, and they also own Bath & Body Works and a few other retailers. And L Brands doesn't have the capacity to identify and develop and manufacture all their own products. And so what they do is they work with Mast, and so Mast Global Fashions can help develop the products and manufacture the products and then deliver them to the store. So Mast also works with Express and Betsey Johnson. So they assist their customers in the design process, the manufacturing process, and they monitor the quality. They focus on compliance and make sure everything is done correctly. And so, you can work with that third-party company to develop your products. Working with third-party company does have higher cost, and you do have less control over the quality. So you have to be very careful with those products to make sure that they do meet your quality control levels, and you have to stay with a very close relationship with those third-party companies. The other thing with working with a third-party company is that there is generally a longer lead time, meaning that it's going to take longer to get the product to your store. So you have to allow for that in your timing process. So we're going to talk now about negotiating with your vendors. Negotiating with vendors happens mostly with your national brand product, but sometimes you do have to negotiate with your materials providers if you're sourcing products. But when you're buying these national brand products, you should always negotiate with your suppliers because generally you're able to get some deals and some help with the product that you're going to be selling. So there are a few different things that retailers should always be ready to discuss when they're negotiating, and we're going to walk through those here. The first thing that you should always discuss with your vendor is last season's merchandise. As a retailer, you want to try to negotiate being able to return any unsold merchandise from last season. Think about a department store for a second. Department stores don't sell last season's clothes. They are only selling this season's clothes, or this year's styles and fashions. And so if you have last season's merchandise and you have a lot of it, you could clearance it in your store and try to make a little bit of money. Or you can negotiate with your vendor to return any unsold merchandise for the price you paid. So you can break even on that a little bit. Now, the vendor might not always want the merchandise back, but sometimes the vendor might offer you some markdown money. And markdown money are funds that the vendor gives the retailer to offset the loss in profit for the markdowns that they make in store. So when you negotiate last season's merchandise, you might say, please buy back the merchandise because I don't have room to sell in the store. And you might hope that your vendor says, I won't buy it back from you, but I will give you some markdown money so that you can clearance the product and still make the same level of profit. And that would be a win-win. Another thing to negotiate is price and gross margin. So as a buyer, a retail buyer, you obviously want to pay less for the merchandise in order to be able to achieve higher margins on it. But the vendor wants to get a higher price to cover their own margins. So this is a negotiation point where you might be able to get your vendor to give you a margin guarantee. And so if you, as a retailer, agree to advertise the product, the vendor might be willing to give you a markdown guarantee through some markdown money, promised markdown money, in order to help cover the margin that you both want to earn. So another thing to negotiate are additional markup opportunities. Vendors can generally offer discounted prices to the retailer on excess inventory. So let's say that as a vendor, you've manufactured a lot of products, but then you had some retail orders that were canceled. You had some retailers who returned your merchandise, or maybe there were just overly optimistic sales forecasts done. As a retailer, you might be able to buy some of that leftover merchandise at a very low cost and then sell it in your retail store for that high price to make a very big margin. So only certain types of retailers would want to do this, to buy that last season's merchandise at a low price and then resell it. So that's something you can talk about in the discussion boards for Chapter 13. What types of retailers would be willing to buy last season's merchandise at a low price in order to be able to sell it to make some additional markup. Another thing to negotiate are the terms of purchase. So as a retail buyer, you want to negotiate longer payment terms. So you might say, we'll pay you 50% upfront, 25% when we receive the product, and the remainder 25% after the product sells. Obviously, the vendor is going to want you to pay 100% upfront. So you have to negotiate the terms of that purchase. And the reason why you, the retail buyer, wants to negotiate those longer payment terms is because it does improve your cash flow. It lowers your liabilities. It can reduce your interest expense. And so it helps you be able to manage that cash flow and your assets a little more smoothly. Another negotiation point is exclusivity. Retail buyers want to negotiate, of course, that no other retailer can sell the same item. A vendor obviously wants their product to be sold at multiple retailers. So the negotiation here might be that you, as the retail buyer, ask if you can get the product 2 weeks early, or ask if you can get the product in a certain color that's not offered anywhere. So there's ways you can differentiate that product in order to get yourself some exclusivity. And again, that exclusivity is going to build customer loyalty because they can only get it at your store. Two more. The next one we're going to talk about are advertising allowances. So retailers will ask the vendor for some advertising money to help advertise their products. And this is called co-op advertising. And it's a program that's undertaken by the vendor where the vendor agrees to pay part or all of the advertising. And buyers want vendors to provide this advertising allowance. So how this works generally, let's think of Walmart. Walmart sends out a weekly circular in the newspaper to all of the people who live in that area. And the way they decide what products get in the ad are that they look at what are the best-selling products, what are items we have on sale this week. So they make decisions there. But how do they decide what products go on the front page? Well, sometimes they work with vendors to say, if you give us a certain amount of money that we can allocate to advertising, when we develop our advertisements, we'll put your product on the front, or we'll put your product on our billboard. And so sometimes those advertising allowances help pay for the advertising expense the retailer has to incur. And vendors often want to provide advertising allowances because it helps give their product more visibility. And then the last thing that you negotiate as a retail buyer is transportation. Cost of shipping merchandise can be exceptionally high, especially if it has to come from overseas, or you have to send it by plane or ship. Those fees get very, very, very high. So you often negotiate who pays shipping the product from the manufacturing facility to your distribution centers or stores. A lot of times that ends up being, you can negotiate a 50-50 split pretty easily with your vendor. So those are the 7 things that you want to try to negotiate with your vendor. And the most important thing to remember is that we're looking for a win-win here. So your vendor's not just going to give in and give you everything you ask for. So when you're talking about negotiating, you have to go into that negotiation with both this is everything that I want, and this is where I'm willing to give a little bit and make sure that my vendor gets to benefit as well. Because building that relationship is going to be so important, right? Building a relationship with your suppliers can be a sustainable competitive advantage. And so maintaining the relationship, keeping it strong, a lot of that comes into this negotiation and how you go about it as a retail buyer. So with that, we wrap up part 2 of our Chapter 13 lecture. Please post in the discussion boards and talk about maybe an experience you've had at a wholesale market. You can talk about different things that you would choose to negotiate along the way, or any of your thoughts that go along with buying merchandise.